Okay? Sound levels okay? Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start now. Thank you very much. I figured that it might be of some interest, indeed concern, to some members of this congregation to hear a little bit about what's been going on, in particular from the perspective of the World Council of Churches with regard to the crisis in Ukraine. And I know that there are some LWF colleagues here as well who have also their own insight into this situation, in particular in some of the contexts where the WCC has not been focusing. So I'd really encourage the LWF colleagues also to share information that they might want to present. My name is Peter Prove. I'm Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches. And in that responsibility, I have oversight of our portfolio of peace building, human rights and disarmament activities in particular, and then also our relationships with the UN system. So a lot of this has been, this work that I'm talking about in this and other contexts has been done in very close connection with UN partners. Now, obviously, I don't have to tell you, but the situation in Ukraine has come to dominate our world and made some fundamental changes to how we live in the world today and how we are going to be living in the future. It's made very big differences to the geopolitical balances, as well as, of course, to the global humanitarian situation. So a lot of what I'm going to be telling you about has been work behind the scenes, not always productive, but I want to illustrate for you some of the efforts that we in the World Council of Churches have been trying to make in order to alleviate this terrible, tragic conflict. The image on the screen there is a photo I took at the Romanian border with Ukraine, and it illustrates the way in which at that time in, I think it was late March, the refugees were arriving. Mostly women and children on foot, crossing, dragging their suitcases and their belongings to find refuge in the West. And it's illustrative of the situation that displaced people are facing in Ukraine. First of all, some background, because this is not the first time that we've been engaged in the situation in Ukraine. In fact, one of the very first things that I did when I started working at the World Council of Churches was to take a series, quite intensive series of visits to Ukraine in the 2014-2015 period, so immediately after the annexation of Crimea and the incursions in the east. And we were trying to find out what we could possibly do as the ecumenical movement to address that situation, possibly to promote national reconciliation and reunification. Let me explain some complex issues, because when I undertook those visits, it was really, for me, a very deep dive into some of the complexities of the Orthodox Church world and the intra-Orthodox relationships, which are literally Byzantine. So in terms of WCC's footprint in this situation, our membership relationship is with the Moscow Patriarchate, which is headed by the Russian Orthodox Church. And it is through the Moscow Patriarchate that we have our membership constituency also in Ukraine and, for that matter, in Belarus. We don't have separate member church relationships in either of those other countries. So we undertook this series of visits in 2014 to 2015, following those events at that time. And we were encountering a situation where there were already long-standing divisions within the Orthodox Church family. So there was, on the one hand, the very large, recognized majority church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But there was also already at that time a split with this other church, the so-called Kiev Patriarchate, which was not recognized by anybody else, but there was already this fracture point, dating back already to the, I think, mid to late 90s. But there was also this very interesting entity called the All-Ukraine Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which was like a forum for essentially all the religious entities in Ukraine, all of the church traditions, but also the Muslim and Jewish communities in Ukraine. And I found it an extraordinary thing that this sort of entity existed even in the teeth of this terrible crisis that was already a major crisis at that time. So you had even the representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate and the so-called Kiev Patriarchate sitting together in that forum, discussing and agreeing upon common positions, believe it or not. And I found that very, very significant, because it illustrated that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate was doing something that the Russian Orthodox Church would never have done, would never have sat in the same room with this uncanonical Kiev Patriarchate. But also, it's important to know that even if, of course, the term Moscow Patriarchate was already a very neuralgic one at that time, but this church was, and I think still is, the largest church with constituency in all parts of the country, including in the separatist areas, with the Ukrainian-speaking majority and the Russian-speaking minority fully on board, with a clear public policy position in favor of Ukrainian territorial integrity, and, as I said, functioning more or less independently from Moscow, even though it was called Moscow Patriarchate. So I thought it represented a unique institution for the possibility of national reunification in Ukraine. Every other direction at that time was in favor of a Ukrainian patriotic identity in opposition to the Russian identity. And there's no hope of reunification in that direction. So we came back thinking, you know, we really have to try and support this church, despite its bad reputation in Ukraine because of Moscow Patriarchate in the name, to do what it can to try and promote national reunification. Unfortunately, as you may know, there was a big schism that broke out in the Orthodox world because of the reasonable assessment by Patriarch Bartholomew in Constantinople, Istanbul, that Ukraine deserved an independent church, independent of Moscow. He wasn't wrong. So he ended up granting autocephaly, or independence, to another church, another Orthodox church in Ukraine. And that caused, of course, a major schism between Moscow and Constantinople. And that meant that we were somehow neutralized. We couldn't really enter into this focus, this center point in this division between our own members in the ecumenical movement. So that was extremely unfortunate. So we have this now autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is the touchstone of this schism between Moscow and Constantinople. But I also have to say that I was very alarmed by the political attack upon the Moscow Patriarchate Church, also in the general media, that really was hammering this church as being, in effect, a fifth column within Ukraine and a treasonous entity, in effect. And that did a lot to undermine whatever potential that church might have had to bring about reconciliation and reunification. So, bringing us to more recent times, this period of escalating tensions and then ultimately the invasion this year. We were already in January, well, indeed before, but in January, trying to flag up concern about the escalating tensions. And we issued a statement to that effect on the 25th of January. Then you might recall this infamous address by President Putin on the 21st of February. It's worth having a look at that again, because I think it is true that even if we absolutely disagree with every action that President Putin has taken, that he is the proximate cause of this crisis. And yet, there's kind of a little bit of truth in some of the justifications that he has given, including with regard to NATO expansionism, but also the justification that he offered based upon the need to protect the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which he said was under attack by the Ukrainian government, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Then on the 22nd of February, we issued another statement calling for reduction of tensions and negotiations. But then, of course, on the 24th of February, we had an invasion. Now, none of us really expected this. Myself, I was saying up until that point, this isn't going to happen. Putin is just trying to leverage political advantage. It's just a threat. But then he invaded. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I have to say that that was predictable. When we look back at the history since 2014 and even from the mid-90s, it was predictable. Could have been foreseen, should have been foreseen. On the 24th of February, we naturally called for an immediate end to the current armed hostilities, but we also undertook immediate consultations with our counterparts in Moscow to understand the situation from their point of view. And according to them, this was going to be a very limited military operation. It was going to be just targeted on winning back the areas, the regional areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, and that it would be very precise and targeted and would avoid civilian casualties. Well, we already knew at that time that this was a multi-pronged attack in essentially all parts of the country, and that already significant civilian casualties were being encountered. So there was a fundamental divergence of realities already at that time. But I think what's really significant, and I want to flag this up for you, is what happened later that evening on the 24th of February, when Metropolitan Onufry, who is head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and who has not, to my knowledge, previously been vocal on public policy issues before this, has always been content to let Moscow speak for him. On this evening, he issued a direct call to President Putin by name, calling upon him to stop this, quote, fratricidal war, unquote, and likening it to Cain's murder of Abel. Now, I don't think it gets much stronger in church speak, right? That was a real something out of the blue we totally hadn't expected. And then just a few days later, the Holy Synod of that church also issued an appeal to Patriarch Kirill to intervene with the political leadership to stop this fratricidal war. Also a direct challenge to Patriarch Kirill as the father of that church in Moscow. Very interesting development, and it's evolved since then, as some of you will be aware. Oh, and of course, we immediately took that opportunity to amplify the appeal that Metropolitan Onufry had taken with a statement by the acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, essentially saying the same thing to President Putin. I mentioned the appeal made by Metropolitan Onufry's church to Patriarch Kirill, but there's also been a succession of such appeals by the WCC on the 2nd of March, again, basically mirroring Metropolitan Onufry's words. But then on the 10th of March, we actually got a reply from Patriarch Kirill. No surprise, it was very disappointing. It didn't actually address the substance of the issue that we were asking him to address. But it did affirm the role of the World Council of Churches as a unique platform for dialogue and for discussing such difficult issues. So we took that as an encouragement to try to do more of that sort of thing, of promoting dialogue. And then on the 19th of April, there was a further letter from the WCC to Patriarch Kirill calling him to intervene for Resurrection Sunday during the Easter period for at least a few hours of respite, at least a few hours of ceasefire, which we didn't get a public response to. We did get a private response, which in essence was that he couldn't do anything about that because there was concern in Moscow that any such respite would simply be an opportunity for the Ukrainian forces to regroup and to counterattack. So very much involved, if you like, in the military strategy that Russia was pursuing. Understandably, especially when we've seen some of the public statements and sermons by Patriarch Kirill, which are read in the wider world as being substantiation of armed aggression, offering theological support for the actions that are absolutely illegal, absolutely immoral, that have been taken by the Russian leadership. So as you can imagine, there is very deep concern within the wider ecumenical fellowship about this, what we perceive as misuse of religious authority and religious language to justify armed aggression. So there have been a spate of calls for the Russian Orthodox Church to be excluded from WCC membership. And I'll say more about that a bit later on, but for the moment, we still feel that our highest and best use is to promote dialogue rather than to contribute to exclusion. So we've been trying to bring together a roundtable or roundtables among the church leaders from Russia, from Ukraine, and from neighboring European countries to actually come together to understand what is going on and what the position of the Russian Orthodox Church actually is in this context. Unfortunately, we haven't been terribly successful. But before I come to that, I also want to mention what for me was a very important conversation that we had with the Swiss ambassador here in Geneva in the few days after the invasion. He summoned a meeting of some of the representatives of some of the peace-building organizations based in Geneva to discuss this situation. And he started by saying, first of all, that he was grief-stricken, that his own country, Switzerland, had given away its traditional neutral and potential mediation role by joining the sanctions, and therefore now was considered as an enemy by Russia. He was very disturbed that, again, it's entirely understandable in the circumstances that there was so much energy at the diplomatic level to shore up a united opposition to the Russian aggression. But from his point of view, it was extremely disturbing that there was no equivalent investment in trying to do what diplomats are supposed to do, to engage in diplomacy, to have dialogue, to enter into negotiations. As he pointed out, there is no end to this crisis, ultimately, without diplomacy, without negotiations. But he did not see anything happening on the European side or on the American side in that regard. Moreover, he drew attention to some of these initiatives like the exclusion of Russian athletes from the Paralympics, the deplatforming of Russian academics from institutions like CERN. And he said, what possible use can those measures be other than to provide substance to President Putin's discourse about the rest of the world being viscerally anti-Russian? That was a real problem from his point of view, and that said something to me. So we initially tried to bring together these roundtables for discussion between our counterparts within the ecumenical movement. We made a first attempt in March, 30th of March. The Russian delegation was fully prepared to come. They in fact came. Metropolitan Hilarion, who will be known to some of you, number 2 at that time in the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, traveled. But he arrived in Geneva airport and was sent back home because his name appeared on a Schengen area no entry list. Estonia had put his name on that list. So even though he had the visa, he was sent home, and we missed that opportunity to have a dialogue. We tried again on the 10th of June. Again, with the full commitment from the Russian Orthodox Church to participate. Guess what happened? 2 days beforehand, Metropolitan Hilarion was removed from his position and sent into exile in Hungary. We don't know why, but presumably because he was trying to engage in dialogue and he was trying to offer some opportunities for a real discussion about this issue. We don't think it was necessarily Patriarch Kirill's own decision. We do think that there was a strong political push for him to be outplaced in that way. Nevertheless, we did have the opportunity during the intra-Orthodox pre-assembly that took place in Cyprus in mid-May, where the Russian delegation was present, unfortunately no Ukrainians, but the Russian delegation was present, and it gave the opportunity for, at least among the Orthodox Church representatives, to discuss this matter. And really, you should be aware that the intensity of feeling among the Orthodox churches over this issue is no less strong than in the wider ecumenical movement or in the wider world. But they then had the opportunity to actually talk and to understand a little bit. And that really helped to, I won't say eliminate tensions, but to at least convey the possibility of actually discussing this issue in a constructive manner. And that gathering issued a joint condemnation of the war, in which the Russian Orthodox Church representation was fully implicated. They did not object to it. They joined it. I think that might have had something to do with what subsequently happened to Metropolitan Hilarion also. Most recently, during the WCC Central Committee meeting that took place in the middle of last month, in June, we had the same opportunity to meet. There was also a Russian Orthodox Church delegation, unfortunately no longer with Metropolitan Hilarion, but with others. And again, we had the opportunity, the salutary opportunity, to discuss and to begin to find some sort of way forward. And I'll say more about that later. But I want to shift also now to the humanitarian focus, because in addition to the, let's say, political or dialogue focus, we also tried to bring a humanitarian focus to our activities. So we issued a number of statements addressing these issues. I don't need to go into them in detail. But also on issues of international humanitarian law regarding the protection of civilians, the appropriate treatment of prisoners of war and the like. And also, of course, a strong reaction to the reported atrocities that we've seen all too many instances of in areas that fell under Russian occupation. And during the Executive Committee meeting of the WCC, we issued a statement on the global humanitarian consequences. So as much as we acknowledge the terrible humanitarian impacts in Ukraine itself, and of course for those who are displaced and are now refugees in other countries, we also wanted to highlight the impacts in terms of the escalating global food crisis, the impacts in other ways in terms of social and economic instability, and this is something I really want to emphasize, the impact that this conflict was having on our collective international capacity to actually do something about climate change in the last few remaining years in the window of opportunity we have to make fundamental changes. We are losing that because of this conflict. So in this humanitarian modus, we undertook 2 joint visits with ACT Alliance to border areas with Ukraine, starting on the Hungarian and Romanian sides and passing a few 40 kilometers or so into Ukraine from the Hungarian side, in order to see what the churches and church-related organizations were doing for the refugees in those border areas. So we were particularly working with Hungarian Interchurch Aid, with HEX, the Swiss Protestant Church Agency, and their activities in Romania and just across the border, and also with the Romanian Orthodox Church and the church-based ecumenical organizations like AIDROM that were responding to the refugees. One thing that I want to emphasize here is how prominent the church-based response was to the refugees everywhere in all of those border areas, and how invisible the UN response was. There was hardly any visibility of UN or most other international humanitarian agencies present at that time, so we're talking in mid-March. And that's because the UN system was very weak in the countries concerned. There were very small country offices in Romania, in Hungary, and in Moldova that even closed down their country office beforehand. And they were still in the process of gearing up to actually respond meaningfully to this situation. So they were absent, but the churches were everywhere in that response to the refugees. But then more recently, we also visited the Russian side of the border towards the end of May, where we visited humanitarian facilities and activities in the border areas, in particular the Rostov-on-Don diocese and the Shakhty diocese, so bottom southwest corner of Russia, very close to Mariupol, to Donetsk in particular. And what I want to say about that in general is that we saw, as I'd hoped we would, a genuine humanitarian response on that side as well. That churches, whatever we think about the policy positions in Moscow, either by Patriarch Kirill or by Putin for that matter, but at the local level, the churches in the diocese were responding compassionately and are responding compassionately to refugees received on that side. Has to be said that most of those refugees are coming, or the vast majority, are coming from the Donetsk and Luhansk areas that were already under Russian control for 8 years. So it's no surprise that they share the Russian narrative. But they are refugees, and the principle of humanitarian neutrality is very important to observe here. And don't forget that, for example, when the International Committee of the Red Cross was trying to establish a modus operandi on the Russian side, you remember what a ferocious attack they came under from the Western media. And it was undermining the principle of humanitarian neutrality. So I think we have to acknowledge that. This is a map of the area that we visited. First of all, on the Hungarian and Romanian side, I don't have a pointer, but maybe you can see the border. This is Hungary there, Romania there, Ukraine there. And you might see the town Berehove, which is just across the border into Ukraine. That's where we traveled to see the work of Hungarian Interchurch Aid on that side of the border, receiving refugees at that far western edge of Ukraine, potentially also before moving across the border to refuge elsewhere. Now, I'm just going to skip through some images. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but just to give you a flavour of what we saw on that visit from the western border region. Oh, this was a family that we encountered across the border in Ukraine, in that place, Berehove, hosted in I think it was a college that had been repurposed to look after displaced people. This was a family coming from from Mykolaiv, which was already then under very intensive shelling, and that they'd fled as a family to this far western edge. The father was not going to be able to go across the border because, you know, men under 60 in Ukraine are not allowed to leave, and his family would be leaving and going elsewhere shortly after our visit. But that was really touching to meet somebody, a family like that, who were facing that separation. Yeah, this is some of the visible church response that we saw at the border area. So these are priests of the Romanian Orthodox Church who were manning reception centers just across the border for refugees that were still coming across. This was very poignant. This is one of the border crossings into Romania at a place called Sighet. And there, as I said before, I mean, the most prominent presence was that of, there were more Orthodox priests there than there were security officials. They were all over the place. And they and local charities had brought this collection of stuffed toys to line the bridge, which is the border crossing at that point, for refugee families, as I said, mostly women and children, who were coming across the border to welcome the children. It was really a poignant example of welcome. And this was a family from Kharkiv in the far northeastern part of Ukraine, and which you will know from the news has been under really incessant and intensive attack. So this was a family that was actually in refuge in Bucharest, hosted by AIDROM. And they were doing some painting with Romanian and Ukrainian flags, I guess to recognize the solidarity and support that they'd received in refuge in Bucharest. Now, this is a map of our visit to the areas of Russia at the eastern side of the border. Rostov-on-Don, and the diocese just north, Shakhty, you may be able to see it. And you see how close it is to Mariupol. From Taganrog, which is the most easterly point that we went to, most westerly point on that side of what we went to, it's maybe 70 kilometers to Mariupol. And you see where Donetsk and Luhansk are in relation to those border areas. This is in one of the humanitarian collection points where donations from all other dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church were being received for distribution to refugees on that side. And this is the queue of refugees who were lining up at a church in the northern Rostov area to receive a fortnightly package of essential supplies. And it was an excellent system, very good registration system. The local church officials knew exactly when the refugees were scheduled to arrive for their fortnightly packages, but they also had a system of providing for special services and special needs that the refugees might need. They had an average of 130 to 160 families every day in that fortnightly rotation. It was a very professional system, at least as professional as what we saw on the western side of the border. Clothes as well. Large donations in clothes being sorted and put on display by category, by size, for refugees just to come and select. This was at the Shakti diocese, the northern diocese, where a similar but smaller scale clothes distribution and basic supplies distribution was being undertaken. Here is a recently arrived refugee registering. In that facility, there was also a professional psychologist whose services were being made available for trauma counselling for people who were suffering in that way, as I imagine many were. This elderly lady had just arrived from the Donbass region. She was in tears. Her house had just been destroyed. And the local priest was comforting her on arrival. This was a group of women and children who were being housed in one of the convents of the Russian Orthodox Church in that area of the Rostov-on-Don diocese. And this was in another facility, what is normally a children's summer camp on the Taganrog Peninsula, where refugees had come. They were being supported there by the local authorities, not by the church. But the church's role here was to come, visit the refugees, counsel them, but also to take requests for special needs, which the church officials would then take away and source and bring back for distribution to this location. Very nice facility right on the Azov Sea, on the shore of the Azov Sea. And as we're walking around, we sort of had kind of outdoor town hall meetings. We would meet with groups of people like this and just talk to them and hear what they had to say about their experience. And I think what I want to convey to you is that even if we consider what we hear about, President Putin has said that one of the reasons for the invasion was because of intensified attacks from the Ukrainian side already for some weeks beforehand. Every single one of the refugees that we spoke to here, they said the same thing. They said they'd had to flee from their homes in the Donbass area because of intensified artillery fire from the Ukrainian side already since the 18th of February, so almost a week before the invasion. I don't know what to make of that, honestly. When I was talking to before this trip, I was in touch with some of my counterparts in Ukraine and asked them about that. Is it true that there were these intensified artillery attacks already from, a week beforehand? They said no, they didn't believe it. Or that if there were, it was because of Russian provocation. But the consistent narrative from these refugees was that they'd fled under fire from the Ukrainian side. What do we make of that? Other than to acknowledge that there is another side to the story. It isn't just black and white, good versus evil. There is another story, and it should be heard. Some more of the refugees we met with. Father Evgeny is the head of the Humanitarian Response Department of the Rostov-on-Don diocese, talking to some of the children there. This couple made an impact on me. This was in another location. They were not from the Donbass. They were not from the areas that had been already for 8 years under Russian control. They came from Mariupol. And their story was that they'd had to flee from their apartment in the center of the city to find safety with the Russian forces and came across the border from there. We asked them, could you imagine returning to Mariupol? They said, only if it remains part of Russia, not if it goes back to Ukraine. They described kind of a long-term social exclusion and attack. I don't mean physical, but attack in other ways on anything and everything Russian and Russian speaking. And they didn't want to go back unless it remained part of Russia. So again, I'm sure that this is a tiny minority of the experience of people in Mariupol, but it's something that we heard from people not in a prearranged meeting, just in an incidental encounter as we were walking around this other location. So, most recently, the WCC Central Committee met in June. And as I said, there was a Russian Orthodox Church delegation there. And they took part also in the Public Issues Subcommittee, where we negotiate texts for public statements. You can imagine what sort of trepidation we had entering into that discussion. You can also understand that in the context of the very insistent calls from many churches or church leaders for the exclusion of the Russian Orthodox Church from WCC membership. And there were actually initiatives being proposed in that Central Committee meeting for that purpose. We managed to have, I felt, a very reasonable discussion with the Russian Orthodox Church representatives. They said, "We know that there is a need for you to speak strongly about this issue. We will not upset consensus in the Central Committee, but we do want to talk to you about some aspects of this proposed text." So they referred to some of the language by which we referred to, for example, condemning the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. They said, did you use the same language to describe or to respond to the invasion of Iraq, which was equally illegal under international law? We said, fair point. Let's go and have a look. What verbs, what terms did we use at that time? We didn't use condemn. We used deplore. Now, I don't know how you describe the relative weight of deplore versus condemn. We said, fair enough, let's use deplore. So that's one example of what we felt was a very constructive discussion process, which illustrated to me the potential of further discussion, of further engagement. We may come to the point of suspension and exclusion if we cannot find a way forward to really address these apparently fundamental divergences in the way we understand the role of church vis-à-vis war, vis-à-vis promoting peace. But we're not there yet. And we think we need to have much more discussion and discernment before we even approach that issue. But let me read to you, just to illustrate the strength of this statement, bearing in mind that the Russian Orthodox Church representatives were part of that negotiation. "We deplored the illegal and unjustifiable war inflicted on the people and sovereign state of Ukraine. We lamented the awful and continuing toll of deaths, destruction and displacement, of destroyed relationships and ever more deeply entrenched antagonism between the people of the region, of escalating confrontation globally, of increased famine risk in food-insecure regions of the world, of economic hardship and heightened social and political instability in many countries. We declared that war is incompatible with God's very nature and will for humanity, and against our fundamental Christian and ecumenical principles. We rejected any misuse of religious language and authority to justify armed aggression. We appealed urgently to all sides in the conflict to respect the principles of international humanitarian law, including especially with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and stressed the critical importance of the principle of humanitarian neutrality in this context. We called for a much greater investment by the international community in searching for and promoting peace rather than in escalating confrontation and division. And here I was very much thinking again about the discussion with the Swiss ambassador. We affirmed the mandate and special role of the World Council of Churches as a platform and safe space for encounter and dialogue in order to address the many pressing issues for the world and for the ecumenical movement arising from this conflict, and we urged our counterparts in Russia and in Ukraine to make use of it. So what next? We've got an assembly coming up in just a few weeks' time, really, at the end of August, first week of September. Now, whatever our plans for that assembly were before the conflict in Ukraine, it's a very different outlook now. I mean, there hardly is an issue in the European region, because it will be focused on the European region, will be in Karlsruhe in Germany. There's hardly an issue in the European region there is no issue in the European region that has a higher priority now. And we have this big issue to address internally about what is our understanding of the role of the church vis-à-vis conflict. What is our calling as peacemakers? Where are our commitments to just peace as opposed to promoting or substantiating armed aggression? We have very serious discussions to have of this type. Not to speak of the global humanitarian crisis, of the risk of nuclear conflagration and all the rest of it that emerges from this situation. So, in terms of our membership relations, Recently, at the end of May, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has declared its independence, that's Metropolitan Onufri's Church, has declared its independence from Moscow. That means, in practice, that they are no longer part of our membership, at least by their own definition. How can we relate to them? How can we bring them into this discussion? That's a problem. On the other hand, we've also received, in the meantime, an application for membership from the other church, the Autocephalous Church, blessed by Patriarch Bartholomew, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. That gives us the opportunity to invite observers from that church to our assembly. But we're also reaching out, again, to this miraculous council, the All-Ukraine Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, to send a delegation of observers as well. And behind the scenes, we are negotiating with them to include a senior representative of the former Moscow Patriarchate Church in that delegation. So we hope to have at least a reasonable representation of Ukrainian participants as well, in the interests of having that dialogue, not in public, but behind the scenes. But will there be Russian participation? We don't know. As of now, the official delegation from the Russian Orthodox Church still has Metropolitan Hilarion as its head. I don't think that's going to happen. There's going to be a change. But you should be aware that there's also a high degree of sensitivity in Germany about the fact that Russians might be coming to this assembly. The government is not at all happy about the idea that we will have Russians in Karlsruhe at the assembly. And that's illustrative of this division, of this separation, of this counter a dialogue mood in Europe right now. So we do need to have these very deep theological dialogues on apparent theological justifications for war, on just peace, and on the Christian calling to be peacemakers. And we hope that we can at least begin that at the assembly. And we need to pursue an ecumenical contribution to prevent what otherwise looks like being, even in a best-case scenario, another generation-long nuclear-armed confrontation, like that which we lived through, those of us who did live through it, during the Cold War. To my mind, that's the best-case scenario out of the current geopolitical situation. It could be much worse. But we need to make whatever contribution we can to avoiding that separation, to maintaining that bridge of dialogue, to be a channel of encounter, because there's very little else happening in that direction. It sounds kind of ironic now, but you know the theme for this assembly that we're coming up to is Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. Is that even... I mean, that sounds terribly ironic now, in the current moment. And yet, I think that's our calling. That's exactly what we have to try and assert and promote. So, that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'd be interested to hear from the LWF colleagues, if there are any who would like to share something about the work done by LWF with regard to particularly visits to Poland, to Slovakia, and now also activities within Ukraine. Actually, do we have anybody from LWF now? I think they were here. Oh, Sivin, do you want to say something?
Bedford Strom and others, I think we saw them part of the delegations and the roundtable is more working through the WCC and with WCC in those more political aspects of the dialogue. And this is an ongoing thing. The LWF has a designated Ukrainian response, and internally in the Communion Office, we have been wrestling with these theological challenges and questions, and how do we talk about peace in this moment. And especially there are times when we hear feedback from member churches out of Europe where they feel more distant with this discussion. What does that mean for like the member church in Indonesia, for example? And now that you have the Indonesian president who actually has engaged much more at a higher level. So this is interesting, and these are dialogues that are more internal to the LWF, of course, at the Communion Office level, as well as between some of the member churches. But I think most of the things that you have said, there are different aspects of it from the more LWF perspective, but definitely the church has been really thrown into the deep end, especially in Poland. And we are thinking about our assembly too next year. Now, what the implications of that as well. So I think I'll just stop there.
Because your assembly is in Krakow, no?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's basically what I say.
Anybody else?
Well, since I have the microphone, because I wanted to ask a couple questions. First one, perhaps, well, I'll just ask my question. First, of course, as this has all been emerging, the parallels and contrasts to our experience during apartheid in South Africa and the final decision to exclude the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa from the World Council, as well as from the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, strikes me as parallel. I was just asking Philip about when you came, because I came in 90, you came in 97, so I'm not sure whether you were so present in those final days of that process, but that's one question. The other question is, thank you for laying out the ambiguities of Russian governmental influence on Patriarch Kirill, and then the different reactions of other parts of the structure. I wonder to what extent you're encountering some parallel influences for the West. You mentioned Germany not being happy with Russians coming to the assembly, so how are you seeing, or what are you hearing from our member churches about some of the dilemmas they may be being put in terms of the stances they take, especially if they're trying to pursue this approach of dialogue and acknowledgement of, it's not both sidisms, but an importance of hearing things from the perspective of the Russian people as well as the Russian government.
To the precedent with regard to South Africa, yeah, this is very much in our thinking. In this regard, though, I want to say that the option of suspension or exclusion from membership, there is really no historical precedent in the life of the WCC for doing that. Yes, there was a very active discussion at that time during the apartheid period about the possibility of excluding the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa because of its theological substantiation of the apartheid system. But we never got to that point because that church withdrew itself voluntarily before that measure was actually applied by the WCC. The only other potential precedent is that relates to the Kimbanguist church in the DRC. We spent 10 years, more than 10 years probably, in the WCC trying to, not me personally because I'm not a theologian, but trying to invite the Kimbanguist church into a dialogue about what are their actual theological fundamental positions and beliefs. And they never came back. They never engaged in the dialogue. So it's only after 10 years of efforts by the WCC to engage in that dialogue that we said, okay, well, not happening, so they're out. So there's really no good precedent. This would be a unique step in the life of the WCC to actually apply that measure. So what I've been saying to everybody is that there is no way that there's going to be an up or down vote on that in, like one Central Committee meeting. There will have to be a long-term dialogue process to try and discern and find a way to navigate through this apparent fundamental divergence. But there's going to be no up or down vote on exclusion or suspension. Now, to the political pressures on both sides. It's self-evident in the case of the Russian side. And we get echoes of that. You know, we hear informally about Russian counterparts saying, you know, we cannot say that sort of thing back home. You know what will happen to us if we do. And we understand it, and especially those parts of the WCC constituency who've lived in totalitarian contexts, during the Soviet period in particular, they know what that's like. So there is at least some increased recognition of that reality, also on the Western side. But I have to say that that experience is really limited at the moment to those churches or to those church representatives who've actually taken part in some of those discussions with the Russians, whether it be at the intra-Orthodox pre-assembly in Cyprus, whether it be at the Central Committee recently. And it's not widely disseminated yet. So there's still a very strong sentiment, entirely understandable in our wider constituency, that the Russians should be expelled. I get it. Totally understandable, but not wise. And it's not representative of what the ecumenical movement could and should be in this context. But there are increasing evidence of pressures on the Western side as well, most notably now with regard to the assembly coming up in Germany. There is a strong sentiment in the German churches as well as in the German government that the Russians shouldn't be allowed to come and that the WCC should stop them from coming. Well, we're not going to do that, obviously. So there's likely to be an issue that we're going to have to negotiate with the German government through the German churches to try and insist upon the importance of allowing Russian participation, because it's a matter of church affairs, but also because of the importance of actually opening up and supporting, at least indirectly, some of these very rare channels of dialogue which are otherwise being closed down everywhere. So I expect that we will encounter more and more of that sort of sentiment, and we will have to try and navigate it and try and insist upon the highest and best use of the ecumenical movement, which is as a forum for dialogue and encounter, including on such very difficult issues as the ones that we face at the moment surrounding the conflict in Ukraine.
Thank you for reminding me the difference between the World Council having the Dutch Reformed Church withdraw, and I was working at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, which did exclude it, and it was on the question of theology. And so when you're talking about particularly the sensitivities and pressures in Germany in relationship with the upcoming assembly, what do you find are the drivers from the member churches in Germany for their reasoning to exclude the Orthodox Church of Russia?
Because of the, again, let me emphasize, entirely understandable, and I would say actually correct, abhorrence of what is perceived to be coming from the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. The substantiation of this armed conflict as being some sort of holy war, in effect, to preserve the values, the Christian values of the Church. You've seen some of the statements from Patriarch Kirill that associate this somehow with LGBT rights or gay pride parades as being the proximate cause of this conflict. So I think there is a very, very deep sense that we are just on a very different page from at least the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, and that by itself is enough to simply say, okay, we can't have you in this fellowship if that's your position. But I think we also need to understand that there are differences of opinion within the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill, even if he's the official head, isn't necessarily speaking the mind of the entire leadership. The Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church has not spoken on this issue, certainly not in the same terms. That's important to remember. So we have to try and play with some of these nuances, and in the meantime hope and pray for the best, that there is or may be a common consensus that can be reached and a constructive path forward. I don't know that there will be, but I think we have to try.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this very clear and presentation that helps to see the complexity. What bothers me really is what you mentioned also, that it's within Russia it seems to be a more and more totalitarian system. We know that there have been priests of the Russian Orthodox Church who held a different view, and there was even one priest who was then put on trial and is in prison now. So there is almost no possibility in Russia to have any different opinion. And so I think it's really important that we are in touch not only with the leadership. Of course, the WCC needs to be in touch with the officials, but also under the radar, so to say, that we keep our relationships. I think that's just my hope, that we can keep relationships on different levels as the WCC.
Indeed, that's our intent. And I mean, at the official level, of course, our relationship is with the official leadership. But we have many, many, many different levels of relationships. I personally remain in contact with counterparts at other levels in Russia, within the Russian Orthodox Church, but also in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly of the Moscow Patriarchate. So we keep those channels open, and we hope that they'll also be of use at some point, without putting in harm's way those with whom we are engaging.
Thanks, Peter. World Vision has been responding to this with things like hygiene kits, cash, Moldova, Romania, a couple places. But actually, where we're seeing more need to respond is because of this global hunger crisis, which was already bad because of climate, conflict. Now we have these 3 Fs of much higher prices around the world for food, fuel, and fertilizer. Yeah. And we're expecting 45 million people to be facing starvation. And when you look in Ukraine, it's terrible. We got about, 30,000 people that have been killed, but orders of magnitude more is the problem. It's the knock-on effects. And I'm wondering if World Council of Churches is talking much about that as well, and the need to not only look at like it's just Ukraine, but say, wait a minute, all these knock-on effects are hugely important as well, because we are finding sometimes the air being sucked out of the room to talk about anything other than Ukraine, when we know that the damage it's causing around the world is immeasurable. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it has to be said, and we acknowledge frequently within the WCC, that the overwhelming focus on Ukraine specifically is to the vast detriment of every other crisis around the world and all the people who are suffering in those contexts, whether as refugees or as people, suffering from other forms of humanitarian crisis. And again, not to speak about the problem that this presents in terms of our collective international response to the threat of climate change. But indeed, the executive committee that met before the central committee focused on this issue of the global humanitarian impacts, not about the conflict in Ukraine so much itself, but the wider ripple effects, which are more like a tsunami for so many other places in the world in terms of food, nutrition, but also other forms of economic instability and political instability. So I think that we can regret the overwhelming focus on Ukraine. On the other hand, the experience of Ukraine also provides us with a leverage point to enter back into some of these wider global contexts. And I mean, for our part, we will be continuing to try and do that. Right now, we're preparing through PARD and in partnership with World Vision and through the International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development, promoting the idea of a high-level policy dialogue between intergovernmental, governmental, and FBO and CSO constituents about exactly this issue. of the global food crisis. So looking forward to continue to partner with World Vision, amongst others, in pursuing that. All right, I think that's, well, unless there were any other questions, or? Yeah, probably do us for today, right? It's been tough. I have to say that I spent much of the last, 6 months, well, 5 months, being pretty depressed. Because we started talking about, holding this sort of roundtable meeting before the 24th of February. We were initially going to do it as a virtual thing immediately following the invasion in that same week. Now here we are, we're in July, and we haven't actually managed to bring the Russian and Ukrainian and European church leaders together. I mean, it's depressing. And it's illustrative of the general situation that we're in, certainly from the Russian side, but also from the Western side. The obstacles to dialogue. And it's tough. Yeah, it's really tough.
I just have a commentary, is that I was living in Siberia for 5 years, and so I have some idea of the way it was. Most of the oil and gas industry is run by Ukrainians, people of Ukrainian origin, and they haven't seemed to react at all. For me, Putin looks like he's in the same problem as with Nicholas II when he went to war against the Japanese. He has to try and find this patriotism and all that rest of it, and it's not working.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've probably seen the internet memes going around that Putin should receive an award for Salesperson of the Year for NATO. But I don't think that that's necessarily a healthy direction, to simply bolster up and to contribute to another NATO versus Russia confrontation. I think it takes us directly into that situation of another generation-long nuclear-armed face-off. We need to avoid that if we can.
So, Peter, I'm going to help you wind this up and say on behalf of the congregation, we are so grateful for the leadership you offer here and for your informative and very thoughtful and nuanced presentation. And I want to suggest that we ask Andy to come forward to offer a prayer for all of this. Okay?
Gracious God, in the midst of this situation that is causing so much pain and so much hurt to untold numbers of people, and is having ripple effects in so many parts of communities' lives and all over the world, we pray for the work of peacemakers, the work of those who are trying to create space for dialogue, the work of those who are trying to find a peaceful and reasoned way forward through this difficult time. We ask for blessings on the work of the WCC and all who are trying to find ways to bring everyone to the table and to find calm and reasoned and just ways forward through this time. Thank you for Peter's work. Thank you for the work of peacemakers and justice seekers in so many different places in Ukraine and in Russia and beyond. So bless their work, and even when it is hard to see a way forward, grant us all patience and wisdom and guidance to continue seeking the peace that you hold out for us and that you show us in Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you.